What is the grace of an outcast? Is it a gift given by a forgiving world, or is it something forged in the fires of that same world's cruelty? In the small, forgotten town of Stone Creek, a place caught in the amber of the late 19th century, this question was not a matter of philosophy, it was a matter of survival. And for a young woman named Ilara, it was about to become the only thing she had left. The story begins, as so many tragedies do, under the harsh, unforgiving light of a Sunday morning. The sun beat down on the dusty town square, baking the cracked earth until it was as hard and unyielding as the hearts of the people gathered there. They stood in a silent, suffocating circle, their Sunday best a stark contrast to the ugliness of their purpose. They were a congregation, yes, but their worship today was not of God, but of judgment. And at the center of it all, alone, stood Ilara. She was 19 years old, with eyes the color of a gathering storm, until this moment that had refused to be broken. Her dress was simple, a faded calico that had seen better days, but it could no longer hide the gentle, undeniable swell of her pregnancy. This child, this life growing within her, was the visible proof of her sin, the testament to the crime for which she was being tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. The air was thick with the poison of scornful whispers, a low, cruel hum that crawled over her skin. The occasional burst of mocking laughter from a group of young men was like a physical blow. This was not a private shame. It was a public spectacle, a ritual designed to carve a lesson into the memory of the town, using her heart as the slate. On the whitewashed steps of the only church in Stone Creek stood the architect of her humiliation, Elder Thornton. He was a man whose piety was as starched and rigid as his collar, the village's iron-fisted patriarch. His face was a mask of righteous fury, but beneath it, a sliver of something else flickered in his eyes, the cold, calculated satisfaction of a man cementing his own power. It was his son, Liam, who was the father of Ilara's unborn child, a truth that was the town's most poorly kept secret. With a voice that boomed across the silent square, a voice he usually reserved for sermons on fire and brimstone, he began to speak. He didn't call her by her name. He called her a stain, a blight, a disgrace upon their God-fearing community. And then, on behalf of his family and, he claimed, the entire town, he cast her out. The word struck Ilara with a physical force. A searing, white-hot pain of absolute abandonment ripped through her. This was the moment she had been dreading. The nightmare she had prayed would never come to pass. Every eye was on her, waiting. They were waiting for her to crumble, to fall to her knees in the dust and beg for a mercy she would never be given. They expected tears, hysterics, the pathetic collapse of a ruined woman. But Ilara did the unthinkable. She did nothing. A tremor ran from her, a single violent shudder, but she held her ground. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her chin. She looked out at the sea of hostile faces, meeting the gaze of her accusers, one by one. She held it, her silence a shield, a rebellion more profound and unsettling than any scream of protest could ever be. In that moment of quiet defiance, her solitary war had just begun. And you, who are listening to this story now, have you ever stood in a room or in a town square of your own making and felt the weight of 100 judgments from people who didn't know the first thing about the battles you were fighting? That feeling of being utterly alone, of your truth being silenced before you even had a chance to speak it. It's a cold, desolate place. And it was in that place that Ilara had to find the strength, not just to stand, but to eventually walk away. The dry, cracked earth beneath her feet seemed to mirror the state of her own soul, parched and starved of kindness, a symbol of the barren future they had sentenced her to. Her life had never been a gentle one. She was an orphan, raised by a grandmother whose hands were as gnarled as the roots of the wild herbs she taught Ilara to identify. Her grandmother had taught her two things of value: the resilience of the weeds that could grow in the poorest soil, and the quiet dignity of enduring hardship without complaint. She had always been an outsider in Stone Creek, a girl from the edge of the woods, never quite part of the tight-knit fabric of village life. Her past was a quiet tapestry woven with threads of loneliness and a deep, secret yearning for the one thing she had never known: the warmth and safety of a family. For a fleeting, beautiful season, she thought she had found it in Liam Thornton. Away from the suffocating shadow of his father, Liam was different. He was gentle and kind, and he spoke of a world beyond the suffocating borders of Stone Creek. He saw the wild, untamed spirit in Ilara, and for a time he seemed to cherish it. Their courtship was a thing of secrets, of stolen moments in the twilight woods, and whispered promises under a blanket of stars. It was her only source of light, a fragile, precious hope she nurtured in the deepest parts of her heart, a tiny flower blooming in the desolate landscape of her life. When she discovered she was with child, the news was a terrifying, breathtaking joy. It was the beginning, she believed, of the family she had always craved. But a promise from a weak man is built on sand. The moment Elder Thornton discovered their secret, Liam's vows of love and a shared future crumbled into dust. His betrayal was swift and absolute. He stood by his father's side, his head bowed, a coward, cloaked in the guise of an obedient son. For Ilara, this was more than the abandonment of a lover. It was the shattering of her one and only dream. This history of loss, of being left behind, made the public shaming in the square more than just a social punishment. It was the final devastating blow to a soul that was already intimately acquainted with grief. It was the act that would either destroy her completely or fuel a desperate, burning need to prove her worth on her own terms, to the world and to herself. Now, back in the oppressive heat of the square, that history gave her the strength to hold their gaze. She saw Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, who had once given her a warm loaf of bread just for a smile, now clutching her shawl and looking away as if Ilara carried a plague. She saw old Mr. Hemlock, who had paid her to mend his fences just a summer ago, now staring at his boots, his face a mask of grim complicity. These were not monsters. They were ordinary people, terrified of being on the wrong side of power, willing to sacrifice one of their own to maintain the fragile peace of their community. Their collective judgment was a force far more powerful and cruel than Elder Thornton alone. The sun climbed higher, a merciless white eye in a cloudless sky. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. The dust kicked up by the shuffling feet of the crowd filled her throat, and she longed for a single drop of water. The child within her, once a source of secret joy, now felt like a leaden stone, a permanent anchor to her shame. Every whisper that reached her ears, harlot, shameless, Thornton's folly, was a fresh cut. She was being unmade, disassembled piece by piece in front of them all, reduced from a person to a cautionary tale. Yet she remained standing, a solitary, unmoving figure, in a world that wished she would simply vanish. Finally, Elder Thornton made a sharp, dismissive gesture with his hand, as if shooing away a stray dog. The show was over. The lesson had been taught. The crowd began to break apart, their morbid curiosity satisfied. They moved back to their Sunday dinners, and the whispers slowly fading as they put distance between themselves and the source of their discomfort. And, in the moments that followed, a silence fell over the square, a silence that was somehow heavier and more menacing than the noise had been. What would happen to her now? Where could she possibly go? The unspoken question hung in the air, a promise of the suffering that was yet to come. Then she took a single step. the sound of her worn leather shoe scuffing against the hard-packed dirt was deafening in the quiet. Then another, and another. She began to walk, not toward the main street where the shops and homes were, but toward the overgrown path that led away from the heart of the village, toward the woods. Her back was straight, her head held high. She did not look back. She was walking away from the only home she'd ever known, into an exile that had been decreed for her. Each step was an act of will, a refusal to let them see her break. She was walking toward a dilapidated, abandoned cottage at the very edge of the woods, a place of rot and ruin that was now to be her only shelter. This cottage was a physical manifestation of her new status. Its roof sagged in the middle, the porch steps were rotted through, and a broken fence leaned at a drunken angle, a pathetic barrier against a world that had already breached all her defenses. Weeds and thorny vines clawed at the walls, as if nature itself were trying to reclaim the structure. This was not a home. It was a tomb for the living, a place where a person could disappear. As she pushed open the groaning, swollen door, the smell of damp earth, decay, and forgotten things rushed out to greet her. The light inside was dim, filtered through years of grime on the single cracked window pane. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sun, tiny ghosts in the oppressive stillness. She had been cast out, abandoned, and left with nothing but the life inside her and the four crumbling walls around her. The world had declared her story over, but as the sun began to set, casting long, lonely shadows across the floor, a different truth began to settle in her heart. This was not the end. It was the beginning of a story they had never intended to be written. The first night in the cottage was a descent into a cold, profound darkness that had little to do with the setting sun. The structure was less a shelter and more a collection of gaping wounds held together by stubborn ivy. Wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying the scent of damp earth and the ghosts of 100 forgotten winters. Elara sat on the floor, her back against the decaying wood, one hand resting protectively on her belly. There was no furniture, no blanket, nothing but the thin calico of her dress to ward off the encroaching chill. The silence was a living thing, broken only by the scuttling of unseen creatures in the thatch above and the frantic, terrified beating of her own heart. This was the reality of being cast out. It was not a grand, dramatic tragedy, but a slow, quiet, and deeply cold erasure. The world had not just turned its back on her. It had pushed her into a grave and was waiting for her to have the decency to lie down and be still. As the moon cast a pale, skeletal light through the grimy window, her mind, seeking any refuge, fled from the present and drifted back to another small house, one filled not with rot, but with the scent of drying herbs and wood smoke. Her grandmother's cottage. It was a place of quiet strength, a world contained within 4 small sturdy walls. She could almost feel the rough, callous texture of her grandmother's hands, see the intricate map of wrinkles around her eyes that would soften when she smiled, a rare and precious event. Her grandmother was a woman carved from the same hard earth as the trees of the forest, and she had taught Elara the language of that world, not with gentle lessons, but with practical, unyielding instruction. This root is for fever. This leaf is for a poultice. This one, she would say, her voice as dry as autumn leaves. This one will kill a man if you are not careful. She taught Elara that the world was not kind, but it was honest. A plant would do what it was meant to do, every time. It was people who were unpredictable, their kindness a fleeting season, their cruelty a long and bitter winter. Her grandmother had never spoken of Elara's parents. They were a closed door, a silence that Elara learned early not to knock upon. She grew up with the understanding that she was a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of Stone Creek, a wild thing from the woods that the town tolerated but never truly accepted. She was the herb-gatherer's girl, her hands perpetually stained with dirt and chlorophyll, her knowledge seen as something strange, something bordering on the uncanny. The other children would sometimes taunt her, calling her a witch's apprentice, their fear and suspicion a wall she could never seem to climb. This early solitude forged in her a deep, aching desire for connection, a yearning to be seen not as the strange girl from the woods, but simply as Elara. She dreamed of a life where she belonged, of a home filled with warmth and laughter, of a family that would be an anchor in the unsteady currents of the world. It was a simple, desperate dream, the kind that takes root in the loneliest of hearts. And then, like a sudden burst of sunlight through the dense canopy of the forest, there was Liam. He was not like the other boys in the village, who saw her with a mixture of fear and crude curiosity. He was Elder Thornton's son, destined for a life of importance, yet he sought her out in the quiet spaces at the edge of town. In the beginning she was wary, her heart a cautious, guarded thing, but Liam was patient. He asked about the herbs, not with suspicion, but with genuine interest. He spoke of books he had read, of cities far beyond the stifling horizon of Stone Creek, of a world where a person was not defined by the circumstances of their birth. He saw the fire in her, the untamed spirit that the rest of the village tried to extinguish, and he called it beautiful. Have you ever felt that? That moment when someone finally sees the person you've kept hidden away, the one you were afraid the world would crush. For Elara, it was like taking her first full breath of clean, fresh air. Their courtship was a secret world of their own making. They met in the twilight, in the hushed cathedral of the woods, where the judgments of the town could not reach them. He would bring her small, clumsy gifts, a bird's feather, a strangely shaped stone, a stolen apple from an orchard, and she, in turn, shared with him the secrets of her world, the silent language of the forest. It was in these stolen moments that she allowed herself to believe in his promises. He spoke of a future together, away from his father's iron rule, a small farm of their own where they would be free. He made her believe that the family she had always dreamed of was not just possible, but inevitable. When she realized she was with child, the fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, brilliant joy. This was it. This was the beginning. This child would be the cornerstone of the life they would build together, a life of love and belonging. The dream shattered with the force of a lightning strike. The discovery of their secret was not a quiet affair, but a brutal public unearthing. She never knew how his father found out. She only knew the terror of being summoned to the Thornton house, a place she had never dared to approach. Elder Thornton did not rage. His anger was a cold, controlled thing, far more terrifying than any shouting. He looked at her as if she were a piece of filth that had been tracked into his pristine home, and Liam, the man who had promised her a world of freedom, stood beside his father, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the floor. He did not speak, he did not defend her, he did not even look at her. In his silence, Elara heard the death of every promise he had ever made. The betrayal was so absolute, so complete, that it hollowed her out, leaving nothing but a cold, echoing emptiness where her heart had been. The public shaming in the square was merely the final ceremonial nail in a coffin that had already been built and sealed in that suffocating parlor. Now, in the derelict cottage, the full weight of that betrayal settled upon her. It was one thing to be an outcast by birth, another entirely to be made one by the deliberate cruelty of the one person she had trusted. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of survival. Hunger became a constant, dull ache in her belly. She ventured back toward the village only once, driven by a desperate need for flour or salt. As she approached the general store, she saw Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, hurry pulling her children behind her. Through the window, she saw the storekeeper, Mr. Hemlock, shake his head grimly as Elder Thornton stood in the corner, watching, his presence a silent, unyielding command. The message was clear. She was an untouchable. Her existence was to be ignored, her needs unmet. She was to be starved out, not just of food, but of all human contact. The social architecture of Stone Creek was as rigid and unforgiving as the stone that gave the town its name. Church, and at the center of the church was Elder Thornton. His power was not just spiritual, it was economic and social. He held the mortgages on half the farms in the valley. He decided who received charity from the church fund and who was deemed unworthy. To cross him was to risk not just social ostracization, but financial ruin. The people of Stone Creek were not inherently evil, but they were trapped in a system that rewarded conformity and punished compassion. To help defy the elder, to risk their own fragile place in the community. And so they chose the path of self-preservation, hardening their hearts and turning their faces away. Their collective silence was the weapon Thornton used to enforce his decree. Elara retreated back to her crumbling sanctuary at the edge of the woods, the whispers of the townspeople following her like phantom pains. The children who once would have shyly waved now pointed and whispered, their parents' prejudice already taking root in their young minds. The broken fence around her cottage became a stark physical line between her world and theirs. On one side was the ordered, God-fearing life of the village. On the other was the wilderness, the chaos, the sin they had projected onto her. The land around the cottage was choked with thorns and weeds, the soil dry and cracked. It was a mirror of her new life, barren, harsh, and starved of nourishment. The drought that had plagued the valley to have taken up permanent residence in this small patch of forgotten earth, a perfect symbol for the drought of kindness in the hearts of her neighbors. She spent her days foraging, her grandmother's lessons now the key to her very survival. She dug for roots with her bare hands, her fingernails caked with dirt. She found berries that the birds had missed, and bitter greens that she boiled in a rusty pot she had found half buried near the cottage. Every mouthful of food was a victory, a small act of defiance against the town that wished her to disappear. But the nights were the hardest. The fear was a physical presence in the dark, a cold hand that would grip her heart and squeeze. She would lie awake, listening to the wind, her thoughts spiraling into a terrifying abyss. How would she survive the birth, alone, in this cold, rotting place? What future could she possibly offer this child, a child born into shame and exile? The weight of it all pressed down on her, and there were moments when the darkness felt absolute, when giving up seemed like the only logical choice. It was in one of these moments of deepest despair that she saw it. Pushing its way up through a crack in the warped floorboards was a single tiny green shoot. It was nothing more than a common weed, a bit of stubborn life in a place of death and decay. She watched it for days as it grew, its leaves unfurling toward the sliver of light from the dirty window. It was a small, insignificant thing, yet it held a profound lesson. It did not ask for permission to grow. It did not care that the soil was poor or the light was dim. It simply endured. It survived. Something shifted in Elara then. A spark of her grandmother's unyielding spirit flared to life within her. She was not a stain. She was not a blight. She was a weed. She would find a way to grow in the poorest soil, to survive the harshest conditions. With this newfound resolve, she began to work. Painstakingly clay from the creek bed in the walls, silencing the constant mournful whistle of the wind. She used stones to build a crude hearth, a place to have a small, precious fire. She found a new purpose, a driving force that pushed back against the fear. She was no longer just surviving for herself. She was building a nest, however fragile, for the life growing inside her. She was preparing for a battle, not against the town, but for the future of her child. The work was exhausting, her body growing heavier and more cumbersome each day, but her spirit was slowly, painstakingly being rebuilt. She was fortifying her home and her heart at the same time. The days grew shorter, and the vibrant greens of late summer faded to the brittle golds and rusts of autumn. A new chill began to creep into the air, a damp cold that promised a brutal winter to come. The villagers began to speak of it in hushed, worried tones, noting the early migration of birds and the thickness of the squirrels' coats. They saw it as an omen, a sign of God's displeasure. For Ilara, it was a more immediate and practical threat. A harsh winter meant scarcer food, deeper cold, and a more profound isolation. She worked harder, gathering firewood until her hands were raw, drying every edible herb and root she could find, creating a small, pathetic store against the coming darkness. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows from the trees, she stood at the edge of the woods, looking back toward the distant, flickering lights of Stone Creek. The town looked so peaceful from a distance, a cozy, welcoming haven. But she knew the truth. She knew the coldness that lay beneath that warm glow. She had survived their judgment, their scorn, and their calculated cruelty. She had found a way to live on the scraps they had left her. But as she felt the first sharp bite of the coming winter on the wind, a new and unsettling question took root in her mind. She had learned to withstand the harshness of man, a force she understood. But could she possibly survive the cold, impartial cruelty of nature itself? What she didn't know, what no one in the warm, lamp-lit houses of Stone Creek knew, was that the coming winter carried with it more than just snow and ice. It was bringing a silent, creeping sickness, a shadow that no wall could keep out, a trial that would soon force the town to look into the darkness and confront the very person they had thrown into it. The first snows of winter did not arrive with the gentle, picturesque beauty of a holiday card. They came with a biting, predatory chill that seemed to seep directly into the bones. For the people of Stone Creek, it was a signal to draw their shutters tight, to stoke their fires, and to gather closer to the warmth of family and community. But for Ilara, huddled in her decaying cottage, the first delicate flakes melting on the grimy window pane were a death warrant. The forest, which had been her sparse but reliable pantry, was slowly being sealed away under a blanket of white. The roots grew harder to find, the last of the autumn berries shriveled on their branches, and the small animals she might have snared for a meager meal disappeared into their burrows. The cold was a new antagonist, one without a face or a motive, an impartial force of nature that threatened to finish the job the town had started. The thin walls of the cottage offered little more than a psychological barrier against the wind, which moaned through the cracks like a grieving spirit, a constant reminder of her profound and absolute solitude. The hunger was a living thing inside her, a dull, coiling ache that was her first thought upon waking and her last companion before a fitful sleep. It sharpened her senses, making the distant smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney an almost unbearable torment. She could picture their kitchens, the steam rising from pots of stew, the scent of baking bread, filling the warm, lamp-lit air. She survived on a thin, bitter tea brewed from pine needles and the last of her dried roots, which she would chew on for hours to trick her stomach into feeling full. Her body, already taxed by the growing life within her, began to fail her in small, terrifying ways. A dizzy spell would overtake her as she stood, her vision tunneling to a pinpoint of black. Her hands trembled with a weakness that had nothing to do with the cold. The child inside her was taking everything she had left to give, and she feared, with a cold, clear certainty, that soon there would be nothing left. Driven by a desperation that overrode her pride, she made one more attempt to appeal to the humanity of the village. Her target was the general store, her goal a small bag of flour, a handful of salt, anything to turn her foraged roots into something more substantial. She waited until dusk, hoping the shadows would offer some cover, but her presence was felt the moment she stepped onto the main street. A silence fell, doors closed softly, faces turned away. At the store, Mr. Hemlock stood behind the counter, his face a grim, unhappy mask. Before Ilara could even speak, a voice, sharp and cold as ice, cut through the quiet. It was Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife. "We don't serve her kind here," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. She did not look at Ilara, but at Mr. Hemlock, her words a command, a reinforcement of the town's decree. Ilara saw the shadow through the elder Thornton's carriage passing by, a slow, deliberate patrol. He did not need to speak. His power was in the fear he had instilled in everyone else. To be seen helping her was to risk becoming an outcast yourself. Shamed and empty-handed, Ilara turned and walked back into the encroaching darkness, the weight of every silent judgment a physical burden on her shoulders. That night, the whispers of the town finally breached the walls of her mind and became her own. She sat in the dark, her arms wrapped around herself, and for the first time, she allowed the poison to seep in. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was a stain, a worthless, shameful thing. What kind of mother could she be, unable to even provide a scrap of bread? What future was she bringing this child into, but one of hunger, cold, and hatred? The shame was a physical sensation, a hot, crawling flush that spread from her chest to her face. It whispered that she deserved this, that her sin had been so great that this suffering was her just and righteous punishment. And isn't that the cruelest trick of shame? It convinces you that the abuse you're suffering is not only deserved, but necessary. Her grandmother's lessons of resilience felt like a distant lie, a story for a different person in a different world. In this world, the world of Stone Creek, she was exactly what they said she was. The antagonism of the village escalated from passive shunning to active cruelty. A group of boys, emboldened by their parents' rhetoric and their own youthful callousness, began to make a sport of tormenting her. They would creep to the edge of the woods and hurl stones against the side of her cottage, the sharp cracks echoing the fracturing of her own spirit. They would scrawl crude words in the dirt outside her broken fence, words like harlot and witch, leaving them for her to find in the morning light. Each stone, each word, was a fresh assault, a reminder that she was not just forgotten, but actively hated. She was their scapegoat, the repository for all the village's unspoken fears and frustrations. By punishing her, they reinforced their own righteousness. One afternoon, a rock thrown with more force than usual shattered the single grimy pane of glass in her window. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet woods. Now, even that fragile barrier was gone. The cold and the hatred of the world could come in unimpeded. With every passing day, impending childbirth of her grew from a distant dread into a monstrous, looming terror. Her body was a constant, aching reminder of her vulnerability. The child moved within her, a life full of innocent, unknowable promise, yet its every kick and turn sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She would lie awake in the suffocating darkness, her hands on her belly, her mind racing through a litany of horrors. What if the birth came during a blizzard? What if something went wrong? Who would help her? The image of herself, alone, bleeding and dying on the cold dirt floor, became a recurring nightmare that haunted her waking hours as much as her sleep. This fear was more profound than the hunger, more chilling than the winter wind. It was the primal terror of facing life's most elemental trial, utterly and completely alone, with no gentle hand to hold, no comforting voice to guide her through the pain. To escape the terror of the future, her mind would sometimes retreat. There was no solace, but even the memories of Liam were no longer a source of warmth, but of a bitter, burning anger. She remembered one specific evening, sitting with him by the creek as the fireflies began to rise. He had taken her hand and sworn, his voice thick with sincerity, that he would never let anything bad happen to her, that he would stand against his father, against the whole world if he had to protect her and the life they would build. He had made her believe him. The memory was now a mockery, a testament to her own foolishness. He had not stood against his father. He had stood beside him, his silence her condemnation. The love she had felt for him had curdled into something hard and painful in her chest, a stone of resentment that she carried everywhere. His betrayal was the wound that would not heal, the source from which all her other sufferings flowed. As the winter deepened its grip on the valley, a new and unfamiliar fear began to thread its way through the village. It started as a whisper, a rumor carried on the frozen air. A child in the village had taken ill with a cough that would not quit, a fever that burned hot and fierce. Then another. It was a strange sickness, a wasting fever the old folks called it. It seemed to defy all the usual remedies. The town physician, a man of limited skill and even more limited imagination, prescribed useless tonics and impotent prayers. Elara, on the edge of the woods, heard the news in fragments, in the worried tones of her conversation carried on the wind as people hurried past her path. She felt a distant, detached pity, but her own struggle was too immense, too immediate, to allow for much else. She had no way of knowing that this creeping illness, this shadow falling over the town that had cast her out, was a harbinger of a trial that would soon intertwine her fate with theirs in a way no one could have ever imagined. Then came the blizzard. It was not a storm, it was a siege. The sky turned flat, menacing gray, and the snow began to fall, not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet. The wind howled like a wolf, piling the snow into massive drifts that buried fences and blocked doors. For 3 days, the world was reduced to a churning vortex of white. Inside the cottage, Elara fought a desperate battle for survival. The wind tore through the broken window, which she had tried to patch with rags and mud, blasting her with icy particles of snow. Her small pile of firewood dwindled at an alarming rate. She rationed it piece by piece, huddled as close to the feeble flames as she dared, the cold a constant, gnawing presence at her back. Have you ever known a silence so complete that it becomes a noise in itself? When the wind finally died down on the 3rd night, the world outside was utterly still, buried and frozen. The silence in the cottage was just as profound. The last piece of wood had turned to glowing embers. The fire was dying. In that moment, something inside her broke. The relentless fight, the constant hunger, the gnawing fear, the crushing loneliness, it all came crashing down on her at once. She was so tired. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion settled over her, a weariness not just of the body, but of the soul. She looked at the dying embers, the last vestiges of warmth in her frozen world, and felt a strange sense of peace. It would be so easy to simply lie down, to close her eyes, and to let the cold take her. It would be a quiet end, a surrender. No more pain, no more shame. Just a slow, gentle drift into a dreamless sleep. The will to fight, the stubborn, weed-like resilience that had kept her alive, had finally been ground down to nothing. She was done. She leaned her head back against the icy wall, the cold a welcome numbness, and she let her eyes slip closed. This was it. This was the end of her story. But the story was not hers alone to end. As she hovered in that grey space between consciousness and oblivion, she felt a sharp, insistent, undeniable movement from within. A kick. It was not a gentle flutter. It was a fierce, demanding summons. Life, stubborn and insistent, was reminding her of its presence. It was a declaration. I am here. We are not done. Another kick, stronger this time. It was a physical jolt that seemed to pull her back from the edge of the abyss. Slowly, painfully, she opened her eyes. The embers in the hearth were now just a faint, pulsing red in the darkness. She had almost surrendered. A different feeling began to rise through the exhaustion. Not hope, not yet, but a grim, hard-won resolve. She would not let them both die here. She would not give the town the satisfaction of her quiet disappearance. She did not know how, but she would survive this night. When the first weak light of dawn finally broke through the oppressive grey, the world was transformed. Everything was covered in a thick, pristine blanket of snow. The landscape scrubbed clean and silent. Elara, having survived the night by wrapping herself in every rag she owned and curling into the tightest possible ball, pushed herself to her feet, her body screaming in protest. The cold was still brutal, the hunger a searing pain, but she was alive. And as she stood there, in the profound, muffled silence of the snow-covered world, she heard a new sound. It was distant, but clear in the still air. It was the solemn tolling of the church bell. It was not the cheerful ring for Sunday service. It was a slow, mournful, solitary peal, the kind of tollings that meant only one thing. Death had come to Stone Creek. The sickness was no longer a whisper. It was now speaking in a language everyone understood, and its first words were a promise of the terror that was to come. The sound of the bell was a cold, hard fact in a world that had become a blur of hunger and fear. It tolled for the dead, a stark metallic punctuation mark at the end of a life. And, as Elara stood in the doorway of her hovel, the biting morning air a shock to her lungs, she knew the sickness was no longer a distant rumor. It was a predator, and it was now walking the streets of Stone Creek. The snow-covered landscape, so pure and silent just moments before, now seemed like a shroud. A pristine white burial cloth laid over the entire valley. A profound and chilling thought settled in her heart. They had cast her out to die alone, but now, it seemed, they were all dying together. The grim irony offered no comfort, only a deeper, more desolate sense of the world's cruel and impartial logic. She turned back into the frozen interior of the cottage, the will to move, to do anything, almost completely extinguished, but as she went to pull the warped door shut, her eyes caught something, a disturbance in the perfect unbroken snow. Footprints, not the chaotic tracks of a frightened animal, but the deliberate, measured prints of a person. They led from the deep woods to her very doorstep, and then away again, back into the trees. And there, placed carefully on the one flat stone that served as a step, was a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, terrified bird. Was it a trap, a cruel joke? Her hands trembled as she reached for it, the frozen oilcloth crinkling under her touch. Inside was a small loaf of dark, dense bread, studded with nuts and dried berries, and a handful of what looked like shriveled, blackened roots. It was not a feast, Elara. It was a miracle. It was the first act of human kindness she had received in months. The gifts continued. Every 2 days, just before dawn, she would find a small parcel in the same spot, a piece of smoked fish, a small pouch of dried herbs that, when steeped in hot water, created a tea that soothed the ache in her bones, a small jar of tallow that she could use to make a candle, pushing back the oppressive darkness for a few precious hours each night. The deliveries were as silent, mysterious as the falling snow. They were a lifeline, a fragile thread of hope that pulled her back from the edge of despair. She began to connect the offerings to the whispers she'd heard as a child. Stories of an old woman named Agnes, who lived deep in the woods, a recluse who the townspeople called a hedge witch, a woman even more ostracized than herself. It made a strange, painful kind of sense. Only someone who knew the brutal cold of absolute isolation would know how to offer warmth without the burden of pity. One morning, driven by a need to see the face of her anonymous savior, Elara did not wait inside. She huddled in the shadow of the cottage, shivering, a thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and watched. Just as the sky began to lighten from black to a deep bruised purple, a figure emerged from the trees. It was a woman, bent and weathered as an old oak, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and clear as winter ice. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her feet seeming to know every dip and rise of the frozen ground. It was Agnes. She placed a small bundle on the step and turned to leave, but Elara stepped out from the shadows. The old woman did not startle. She simply stopped and looked at Elara, her gaze taking in the swollen belly, the hollowed-out cheeks, the fierce, desperate pride that still burned in her eyes. There was a long, silent moment. Then Agnes spoke, her voice raspy like dry leaves skittering across stone. "A fire needs wood to burn," she said, nodding toward the bundle. "And a mother needs a reason to fight. You have one. Don't let them starve it out of you." That meeting was the turning point. Agnes began to give her more than just food. She began to give her knowledge. She was a living library of the forest's secrets, a keeper of the ancient wisdom that Elara's grandmother had only hinted at. She taught Elara how to read the winter landscape, to see the life that pulsed beneath the snow. She showed her which tree barks could be boiled to break a fever, which mosses could be used to pack a wound, and which roots, when properly prepared, could provide a deep and nourishing strength. Elara was a desperate and eager student, absorbing every lesson, her hands remembering the feel of the earth, her mind reawakening to the language of the wild. The broken fence around her cottage, once a symbol of her imprisonment, now felt different. It was the boundary of her own small kingdom, a world where she was no longer a victim, but a student of a power far older and more resilient than the petty judgments of Stone Creek. Meanwhile, in the village, the fear was solidifying into a cold, hard panic. The church bell tolled with a grim regularity, each peal a fresh reminder of their helplessness. The wasting fever was indiscriminate, taking the strong and the weak, the old and the young. The physician's remedies were useless, and Elder Thornton's sermons grew more frantic, his words filled with brimstone, blaming the sickness on a rot in the town's moral fiber, a sin that needed to be purged. The community that had once been united in their condemnation of Elara was now fracturing, turning on itself. Neighbor eyed neighbor with suspicion, a simple cough earning a wide, fearful berth. The warmth of their hearths could not keep out the cold dread that had seeped into every home. They had built their walls so high to keep the world out, but they had only succeeded in trapping the sickness inside with them. Elara worked, her purpose renewed. Using the skills Agnes taught her, she made her small, dilapidated world stronger. She wove a tight screen of willow branches and packed it with mud and moss to cover the broken window, a small but profound victory against the relentless wind. She felt the child within her move, a constant, living reminder of what she was fighting for. Some days, she would stand at the edge of the woods and look toward the smoke rising from the village chimneys. The anger and the hurt were still there, a hard knot in her chest, but something else was growing alongside it, a strange, dispassionate clarity. They had thrown her away, left her for dead, and now their world was dying. And what about you? If you were in her place, your belly swollen with the child of a man who betrayed you, your spirit scarred by the cruelty of an entire town, what would you feel watching them fall? Would it be the sweet, simple satisfaction of justice? Or would some deeper, more complicated feeling take root? What would you do with the power to watch them suffer, or the knowledge to heal them? One afternoon she saw him, Liam. He was standing at the far edge of the Thornton property, staring into the woods, his form a dark silhouette against the snow. He looked thinner, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a fine wool coat that seemed too big for him. He was a man haunted, trapped in the prison of his own cowardice. Their eyes met across the frozen expanse. There was 100 yards of snow and a universe of betrayal between them. He made no move to approach, and she felt no desire for him to do so. In his eyes she saw desperation and a flicker of something she could not name. Fear, regret. It no longer mattered. She held his gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then she turned and walked back to her cottage. The power between them had irrevocably shifted. He was a prisoner of the dying town, and she, in her exile, was finally, truly free. The time came on a moonless night, the world outside wrapped in a profound and silent blackness. The first pain was a sharp, deep clench that stole her breath. This was it. The terror she had held at bay for so long rushed in, cold and overwhelming. But then Agnes's words came back to her. The lessons, the herbs, the steady, unsentimental strength of the old woman's gaze. She was alone, but she was not unprepared. She moved with a deliberate calm, stoking fire, laying out the clean rags she had saved, crushing the herbs Agnes had given her for the pain. The hours that followed were a primal blur of agony and effort, a battle fought in the deepest recesses of her own body. But through it all, she was guided by a fierce, unyielding will. This child would not be born into weakness and despair. This child would be born of strength. And as the first cry of a newborn baby cut through the silence of the cottage, sharp and vital and full of life, wept Elara, not from pain or sorrow, but from a wave of fierce, triumphant love. She had done it. She had brought life into this place of death. She had won. She held her son to her chest, his tiny, perfect form, a warm weight against her skin, a miracle of flesh and blood. The world shrank to the size of this one small room, this one perfect moment. But the world outside would not be ignored for long. Through the newly patched window, she heard it again, the sound that had become the valley's heartbeat, the slow, mournful tolling of the church bell. It sounded different this time, more urgent, frantic, and then another sound, closer this time, the heavy, crunching sound of footsteps in the snow. They were not the light, practiced steps of Agnes. These were the panicked, desperate steps of someone running, stumbling, a person driven by a terror so great it had stripped them of all dignity. The steps stopped directly outside her door. She held her breath, clutching her newborn child. Closer, her heart pounding against her ribs. She did not know who was coming, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that their arrival would change everything. The battle for her survival was over. But what was coming now, in the deepest dark of that winter night, was the battle for her soul. The pounding on the door was not a request for entry. It was a desperate, frantic assault against the thin, rotting wood. It was the sound of a world ending. Elara, her newborn son, nestled against her chest, felt a jolt of pure primal fear. Her first instinct was to shield him, to press his tiny body closer, as if her own fragile form could protect him from whatever terror was clawing at their sanctuary. The battle for their survival against the cold and hunger was over. But this felt like the beginning of a new war, one that had come to her very doorstep. The footsteps had been heavy, panicked, and now this furious, desperate summons. She held her breath, listening the sounds in the world, the frantic beating of her own heart, and the soft, sleeping breaths of her child. The pounding came again, harder this time, accompanied by a voice, raw and broken, a voice she knew better than her own. It was Liam's, but it was not his name. He was crying. He was crying his father's. A moment later the door was shouldered open with a splintering crack, and the architect of her entire misery stood framed in the doorway, a spectre against the deep pre-dawn darkness. Elder Thornton. He was not the rigid, righteous patriarch she remembered from the town square. His fine wool coat was disheveled, dusted with snow. His face, usually a mask of stern control, was a ruin of fear and desperation. His eyes, wild and bloodshot, found her in the dim firelight, and in them she saw the complete and utter collapse of his world. He looked past her, past the squalor of the cottage, his gaze falling upon the small, sleeping bundle in her arms. He took a stumbling step inside, bringing the biting cold with him. He did not seem to notice the poverty, the dirt floor, the patched-up window. He saw only her and the healthy, living child she held. The sight seemed to break him. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. He tried again, and the words tumbled out, stripped of all their pious authority, naked and pathetic. "My grandson, Liam's boy. He is dying. The fever. The doctor has done all he can. He is gone." The words hung, a confession of absolute failure from a man who had never admitted to any weakness. He was not commanding her. He was not threatening her. He was begging. He, Elder Thornton, who had cast her out like refuse, who had orchestrated her starvation and humiliation, was now on his knees in the dirt of her hovel, pleading for a miracle from the very person he had tried to destroy. And there it was, the moment she had, in her darkest hours, dreamed of, the perfect, exquisite revenge, the complete inversion of power. She held life in her arms, while his house was being emptied by death. She had the knowledge, the strength, the grace that he so desperately needed. All she had to do was say no. All she had to do was turn her back, just as he had turned his back on her. She could watch him crawl back to his grand house, and listen for the inevitable tolling of the church bell. It would be justice. It would be the righteous, satisfying conclusion to her suffering. A cold vengeance tightened in her chest. She thought of the stones thrown by the village boys, the scorn in Mrs. Gable's eyes, the crushing, soul-destroying weight of Liam's betrayal. She thought of the nights spent freezing, starving, her own life and the life of her child hanging by the thinnest of threads. Let them all suffer as she had suffered. But then she looked down. She looked at the small, perfect face of her son, sleeping peacefully, his tiny hand curled around her finger. He was innocence. He was a new beginning. He knew nothing of sin or shame or revenge. He was simply life, precious and pure. And in that moment she understood a truth that went deeper than justice. To refuse to help would be to let their poison finally corrupt her. It would be to become like them, to let cruelty be her guide. It would be to deny the very life she had fought so hard to protect. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, not her words, but the feel of her steady, practical hands. Agnes's face appeared in her mind's eye, her gaze clear and unsentimental, a gaze that saw the world not in terms of good and evil, but in terms of what lives and what dies. What kind of world would she build for her son if she began it with an act of calculated cruelty? The silence in the cottage stretched for an eternity. Thornton remained on his knees, his head bowed, a broken man awaiting his sentence. Alara took a deep, steadying breath, the cold air filling her lungs. She looked at the man who had been her tormentor, and she saw not a monster, but a terrified grandfather, stripped of all his power, pleading for the life of a child. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, but it filled the small space with an authority that dwarfed any sermon he had ever given. "I will come." The words were not an absolution. They were not a forgiveness. They were a choice. a choice to rise above the pain they had inflicted, to be the person they were not. She was not doing it for him. She was doing it for the innocent child and for the woman she was determined to become. The walk back to Stone Creek was a slow, surreal procession. Elara, wrapped in her thin shawl, holding her son tightly against the cold, walked ahead. Elder Thornton followed a few paces behind, his head still bowed, a humbled giant in her wake. As they emerged from the tree line and onto the main path, the first signs of life began to stir in the village. A lamp flickered on in a window. A door creaked open. And then they were seen. A collective, silent gasp seemed to pass through the town. Faces appeared in windows, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and a dawning, terrible shame. The outcast, the harlot, the stain they had scrubbed from their community, was walking back into their midst, and their great leader was following her like a chastened dog. It was a sight that shattered the very foundations of their world. They reached the Thornton house, the largest and most imposing home in the village, a monument to the family's power. Liam was waiting on the porch, a pathetic, haunted figure. When he saw Elara, his face crumpled. He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched, his mouth forming her name, but she did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the door, her purpose clear and unyielding. She walked past him as if he were a ghost, as if he were nothing more than a painful memory she had long since left behind. His irrelevance was a more profound punishment than any words of anger could ever be. She had moved on, not by forgiving him, but by rendering him powerless over her heart. The sick room was a pocket of hell in the otherwise pristine house. The air was thick and stagnant, with the smell of sickness and despair. Liam's new wife, a young woman with terror in her eyes, sat weeping in a corner, while the town physician stood by the bed, his face a mask of helpless resignation. In the center of it all, in a large, ornate crib, lay a tiny, fragile infant, his skin flushed with fever, his breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The room was filled with useless tonics, holy water, and the suffocating weight of impending death. Elara took it all in with a single sweeping glance. Then she began to work. Her voice was calm, steady, and full of an authority that no one dared to question. "Boil water. Bring me clean linen cloths. I need a fire in here, a small one." She moved with a quiet efficiency, unwrapping the small leather pouch of herbs and roots Agnes had given her. The strange, earthy scents of the forest began to fill the room, pushing back against the smell of sickness. She ignored the physician's sputtering protests and the weeping of the young mother. She was in her element now, a world of practical, life-giving knowledge. She crushed dried willow bark into a fine powder, mixing it with a few drops of water to make a paste. She steeped other leaves in the hot water, creating a fragrant steam that seemed to ease the room's oppressive atmosphere. She worked through the day and into the night, a tireless, solitary figure. She gently sponged the infant's burning skin with cool water. She used a clean feather to place a minuscule amount of the willow bark paste on his tongue. She changed the linens, her movements gentle and sure. She was not just a healer, she was a mother, and every action was infused with a deep, innate compassion for the small, struggling life before her. Elder Thornton and Liam watched from the doorway, silent and useless, witnessing a power they could not comprehend, a strength forged in the very suffering they had created. They had tried to break her with insulation, and in that insulation she had found the knowledge that was now their only hope. The vigil stretched into a second day. News of her presence had spread through the village like wildfire. The sick, who had been hidden away in their homes, now became a silent, desperate plea. A knock would come at the Thorntons' door, and her father with fear in his eyes would ask if she could just look at his child. And so she moved. from house to house, her own infant now being cared for by a humbled and silent Mrs. Thornton. She entered the homes of the people who had scorned her, who had refused her bread, who had whispered her name like a curse. She did not speak of the past. She simply worked, her presence a quiet, powerful rebuke to their cruelty. She was a force of life, moving through a valley of death, and with every child she tended, she was rewriting her story, and theirs. The climax came in the dead of the third night, back in the Thornton house. The infant grandson's breathing had grown even more shallow, his small body seeming to shrink before their eyes. The last of the hope in the room had withered and died. Elder Thornton had his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Liam stood like a statue, his face a grey mask of grief. This was the final moment. Elara, her own body aching with a profound exhaustion, leaned over the crib. She placed her hand on the child's chest, a gesture not of healing, but of simple, human connection. She began to hum, a low, ancient lullaby her grandmother had sung to her, a wordless melody of comfort and peace. And then, a change. It was almost imperceptible at first, a slight easing of the tension in the child's tiny limbs, a single, deeper breath, then another. The ragged, shallow gasps began to even out, becoming slower, regular. More. A fine sheen of sweat broke out on the infant's forehead. The fever was breaking. It was not a sudden miracle, but a slow, quiet tide turning. The child's eyes, which had been glassy and unfocused, fluttered and then closed in a true, peaceful sleep for the first time in days. A collective, shuddering breath was released in the room. It was a sound of awe, of disbelief, and of a profound, soul-shattering shame. The woman they had condemned had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and brought their children back with her. The following Sunday was a day unlike any Stone Creek had ever seen. The church was filled to bursting, but the atmosphere was not one of pious celebration. It was heavy, with a solemn, unspoken guilt. After the final hymn, Elder Thornton did not retreat to the vestry. He stood before his congregation on the very steps where he had cast Elara out, and he began to speak. His voice, once a booming instrument of judgment, was now quiet, broken, and heavy with a humility that was more powerful than any sermon. He spoke of sin, but this time he spoke of his own. He spoke of pride, of cruelty, and of a blindness of the heart. He publicly confessed his sin against the woman who had saved them. And then he did the unthinkable. He asked for her forgiveness, not in the privacy of his home, but before the eyes of God and the entire town he had led astray. Elara was there, sitting in a pew near the back, her son in her arms. She did not rise. She did not speak. She simply met his gaze from across the room. She offered no words of comfort, no easy absolution. Her forgiveness was not his to take. Her grace was her own. Her silent, dignified presence was a far more powerful statement than any speech could have been. Her restoration was complete, not because he had granted it, but because she had forged it herself, out of fire and ice and an unbreakable will. In the days that followed, the town was reborn. The change was not loud or dramatic, but a quiet, fundamental shift in the soul of the community. Mrs. Gable, her eyes filled with tears, brought Elara a warm loaf of bread every morning, a silent, daily act of penance. Mr. Hemlock insisted that she take whatever she needed from his store, free of charge, for as long as she lived. The people who had once shunned her now nodded their heads in respect, their eyes holding a new and profound understanding. They had been saved not by their piety, but by the grace outcast. Elara did not leave Stone Creek, nor did she return to Liam, who remained a ghost in his own life, a man forever defined by his weakness. Instead, the town, in a collective act of atonement, built her a small, sturdy cottage near the edge of the woods, with a garden of rich, dark earth. She brought Agnes from her deep woods seclusion, and the two women, the old herbalist and her young protégé, became the respected heart of the community, their wisdom sought after more than any sermon. The broken fence, that symbol of her isolation, was replaced by a small, welcoming gate, always left open. She found her family, not in the arms of a man who had failed her, but in the sturdy resilience of her own spirit, in the fierce love for her son, and in the quiet, respectful community she had reshaped through an act of radical compassion. Her life was a testament to a simple, powerful truth. Grace is not something given by a forgiving world, but something forged in the fires of that same world's cruelty. It is the courage to heal when you have every right to hate. And how many times, in our own lives, are we put in a cage of someone else's judgment? How often are we defined by a single mistake, a single moment, and sentenced to a life of shame by a world that refuses to see our whole truth? Elara's story is a reminder that the harshest winters eventually end, and that the seeds of our greatest strength are often planted in the frozen ground of our deepest suffering. True power isn't found in the ability to condemn, but in the quiet, revolutionary courage to offer healing where there was once only hurt. It's the grace to answer cruelty, not with more cruelty, but with a strength they never saw coming. If this story spoke to the part of you that has ever felt cast out, misunderstood, or underestimated, if you have ever lived through a long winter in your own life, only to find a surprising strength on the other side, share a piece of that feeling with us. Write in the comments below, "I have known a turning point," because every story of survival is a beacon of hope for someone else who is still walking through the snow.